Most people hear the name MK Ultra and think of conspiracy forms, urban legends, or fever dream stories about secret experiments, LSD hallucinations, and government agents gone rogue. But the real truth, the documented truth, is far more disturbing than the myth. Because MK Ultra wasn't the government trying to control minds out of paranoia or madness or science fiction delusion. It was something colder, more calculated, more familiar. It was a business model. A multi-million-dollar state-backed attempt to answer a single question. If you can shape how people think, can you control how they act? And if you can control how they act, what does that mean for governments, for markets, for economies, and for every system built on human behavior? Welcome to the Financial Time Vault, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand MK Ultra, you need to understand the world that produced it. Go back to the early 1950s, a moment when the global economy wasn't yet globalized, but fear was. The Korean War had just ended. American PS returned home making strange confessions, praising communism, speaking as if something had been rewired in their minds. The Soviet Union was rumored to be experimenting with hypnosis, drugs, psychological torture. China was using ideological re-education. Propaganda was becoming a weapon as powerful as artillery. The Cold War wasn't just a military competition. It was a psychological one. And in Washington, inside the CIA's headquarters on East Street, a chilling idea took hold that if the mind can be broken, then perhaps it can be controlled. And if it can be controlled, then it can be used. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed off on a program called MK Ultra. It looked like a research initiative. It acted like a covert operation, but at its core, it was an investment. A massive unregulated portfolio of experiments funded with secret budgets and almost no oversight. Over the next 2 decades, MK Ultra would grow into 149 officially documented sub-projects and likely many more lost to history. The CIA funneled money through front organizations, dummy foundations, and prestigious universities that thought they were receiving research grants. In reality, they were participating knowingly or unknowingly in one of the most ethically catastrophic projects in the history of American intelligence. The methods ranged from reckless to horrific. High-to-seize LSD without consent, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, electroshock repatterning, isolation, psychological dismantling. If there was a line, it was crossed. If there was a rule, it was ignored. The CIA wasn't asking whether something was moral, only whether it might work. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. MK Ultra wasn't just about torture, control, or Cold War paranoia. It was about economics. Because underneath the mad science and secrecy, the program was driven by a belief that human behavior could be engineered and that engineering behavior could tilt the balance of power in everything from geopolitics to markets. This is where the story stops being fringe and starts being uncomfortably familiar. During the same decades, MK Ultra operated in the shadows. Corporations in the light were beginning their own investigations into influence. Madison Avenue was rewriting the rules of advertising. Behavioral psychology was becoming a tool of persuasion. The post-war consumer economy was exploding, and companies wanted to know what makes people buy, what makes them choose, what makes them loyal. 2 worlds, one covert, one commercial, were asking the same question: how do you control decisions? And when you step back and look at the landscape, something becomes clear. MK Ultra wasn't an isolated horror. It was the dark mirror of the emerging science of persuasion, manipulation, and behavioral engineering. But to understand how deeply this runs, we need to look at the architecture of MK Ultra itself. The money trails, the institutions, the incentives. Because it reveals something most people never connect. The intelligence community and the marketplace were learning from the same playbook. The CIA didn't run MK Ultra on its own, it outsourced. It subcontracted. It funded professors, psychiatrists, chemists, neuroscientists, medical doctors, Harvard, Stanford, McGill, dozens of hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, even prisons. The CIA didn't just create a program, it created a shadow research economy. Millions of dollars were poured into academic departments under the guise of behavioral research. Pharmaceutical companies were paid to supply experimental compounds. Hospitals received grants to test new forms of treatment. Professors were quietly told to set aside ethics in pursuit of results. This ecosystem revealed a powerful principle. When institutions chase influence, the money flows fast. That's the part MK Ultra teaches us that most documentaries miss. The goal wasn't only to discover whether the human mind could be broken. It was to see whether it could be predicted, directed, weaponized. And prediction is the bedrock of every financial system on Earth. If you know how people will behave, you can control everything built on behavior, markets, politics, advertising, belief, loyalty. That was the real arms race. The Soviet Union was studying influence through ideology. China was studying it through group pressure. The CIA was studying it through chemistry, psychology, and sensory manipulation. And companies were studying it through marketing, media, and data. This wasn't the search for mind control. It was the search for behavioral leverage, the ultimate economic resource. But to see how MKUltra evolved into something bigger than itself, we need to examine the projects that defined it, not the myths. The documented cases that survived even after the CIA destroyed most of its records in 1973. Project Midnight Climax run out of safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where the CIA hired sex workers to dose unsuspecting clients with LSD while agents observed from behind mirrors. Subject 68 in Montreal, where Dr. Ewan Cameron, a world-renowned psychiatrist, used psychedelic drugs, electroshock, and psychic driving to try to erase and rebuild personalities funded quietly through CIA cutouts. Experiments on prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and students who were never told the truth. These weren't accidents. They were investments in discovering how far behavior could be pushed before breaking. And if you pull the thread, you start to see the real shape of MKUltra, a collision between fear, ambition, science, and money. This is where the line between intelligence and economics blurs. Because while the CIA pursued psychological control for geopolitical gain, the private sector pursued psychological persuasion for profit. And the techniques stripped of their darker extremes began to overlap. While MKUltra tested LSD on unwilling subjects, Madison Avenue tested emotional triggers on mass audiences. While CIA psychiatrists attempted behavioral modification, corporations developed targeted advertising. While the intelligence community studied vulnerability, the market studied desire. One side used secrecy, the other used strategy. Both learned how to shape behavior. And that brings us to a realization most people never consider. MKUltra didn't fail. It shifted, it migrated. Its lessons seeped into institutions that never needed secrecy to use them. When the CIA shut down MKUltra in 1973, or claimed to, it wasn't because the agency suddenly discovered morality. It was because the program had become a liability. Watergate had shattered public trust. Congress was turning its attention toward intelligence abuses, and MKUltra was the kind of operation that, if exposed in full, could permanently damage the government's legitimacy. So the files were burned. Literally, whole archives destroyed in a single directive. Only a few financial records and stray documents survived by accident. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if the operational program died, the research didn't, the knowledge didn't, the incentives didn't. What MKUltra revealed that human behavior is malleable, predictable, and influenceable became the foundation for a new era. An era where control wouldn't come from drugs or hypnosis or secret experiments, but from something far more subtle. From systems, from markets, from technology. The intelligence community withdrew from the shadows just as the private sector stepped forward with better tools, better data, and better incentives. MKUltra was a crude prototype. The real product was built later, not by spies, but by corporations, advertisers, behavioral economists, and eventually Silicon Valley. To understand how the legacy evolved, imagine a relay race. MKUltra ran the first leg, proving you could alter perception, distort reality, and shape behavior. Then the baton passed to universities and research labs studying decision-making, cognitive biases, addiction, and persuasion. Then the baton passed again to marketers refining emotional targeting, to political strategists testing message frames, to media companies designing attention-grabbing formats, and finally to tech companies building platforms where every tap, swipe, and pause is tracked, measured, and fed back into algorithms engineered to influence you. By the early 2000s, what the CIA tried to force through chemistry, Silicon Valley achieved through code. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To grasp what modern influence looks like, we need to pull the thread through the late 20th century, when behavioral science began to merge with economics itself. Traditionally, economics treated humans as rational agents, efficient, predictable, self-interested. But research from psychologists like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who would later reshape the entire field, showed the opposite. Humans are not rational. They are biased, emotional, easily manipulated, not just in extreme conditions but in everyday decisions. These insights became the backbone of behavioral economics, a field that would go on to influence policy, marketing, finance, and technology. And while it had nothing to do with MKUltra directly, it built on the same core idea. If you understand human cognitive weaknesses, you can shape their actions. Governments began using nudges to steer public behavior. Corporations used psychological triggers to create brand loyalty. Financial institutions built models predicting fear, greed, and risk-taking. The modern economy became a laboratory of influence. But now, with consent buried in terms and conditions rather than erased through coercion, the story gets even more interesting as we enter the digital age. The internet didn't just give companies access to data. It gave them access to attention, the raw material of influence. Social media platforms discovered something intelligence agencies never could: the power of voluntary surveillance. Billions of people openly providing behavioral data every day. Habits, preferences, emotions, vulnerabilities, the kind of data MKUltra would have considered priceless. And unlike MKUltra, which operated on a handful of subjects at a time, modern tech companies operate on entire populations. Their influence isn't crude or chemical. It's algorithmic, invisible, personalized. Platforms don't need to control your mind. They just need to control what you see. And from there, influence becomes predictable. This is where the line between governments and corporations blurs. Intelligence agencies study disinformation. Corporations study engagement. Political campaigns study persuasion. Hedge funds study behavioral volatility. Every major institution in the economy now has a department dedicated to shaping perception, or at least predicting it. The lesson of MKUltra, that behavior is the ultimate variable, became the foundation of modern economic power. But we still haven't addressed the issue that brings us here. What does any of this have to do with markets? Everything, because markets aren't driven by supply and demand alone. They're driven by emotion, expectation, fear, confidence, psychological states that institutions now know how to measure, influence, or manipulate. The most valuable commodities today aren't oil or data. They're attention, belief, and behavior. You can see it everywhere. When a company's stock price jumps because of a viral narrative, not fundamentals, that's influence economics. When consumer debt rises because people are nudged into buying more through engineered desire, that's influence economics. When political polarization affects currency stability, that's influence economics. When algorithmic feeds determine what people trust, fear, or desire, that's influence economics. When social media panic triggers a bank run faster than regulators can respond, that's influence economics. This is the world MKUltra helped foreshadow. A world where controlling minds is no longer a covert operation. It's an industry, a market, a business model for companies worth trillions. And here's the part history warns us about. When the tools of influence become powerful, they rarely stay in the same hands. The intelligence community once feared the Soviets would master psychological control. Today, governments fear corporations will. Corporations fear algorithms might. And individuals fear they no longer know what's influencing them at all. So what's the final lesson of MKUltra? The part that matters most to anyone trying to navigate markets, money, and power today. It's this: the most valuable asset in the world isn't capital. It's consent. And the battle for consent happens in the mind long before it happens in a marketplace. MKUltra was the first major attempt to weaponize that idea. It failed because its methods were too brutal, too obvious, too crude. But the principles survived and evolved into something subtle enough to govern the attention economy, shape global politics, and redirect billions of dollars every day without anyone realizing it. History doesn't repeat, but the incentives do. And when institutions compete for power, the ability to shape behavior will always be their most profitable investment. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.